The movie opens with Brian Godlock sprinting through his neighborhood as gunfire echoes in the distance. Drawn toward the sound, he witnesses two rival gangs locked in a violent shootout. One driver is killed, sending a car crashing out of control. As the surviving gangsters speed toward him, Brian grabs a metal pipe and waits. At the last second, he smashes their windshield, nearly causing another crash. The men open fire, forcing Brian to flee. Spotting a forklift, he reacts on instinct, launching himself over the truck and decapitating one of the attackers. But Brian is shot in the back by another survivor, and a heavily tattooed gangster finishes the assault by shooting him through the throat, leaving him for dead. Brian is rushed to the hospital barely alive, while his wife Saya prays desperately at his bedside. Doctors manage to save him, and he slowly begins to recover. Detective Vassal briefly visits, studies Brian, and leaves behind his card. Days later, Brian wakes up, and Saya rushes to him in tears of relief. Physical therapy begins as Brian relearns how to walk, but the attack has stolen his voice. He silently screams at his reflection, overwhelmed by frustration and grief. Saya gives him an artificial voice box, yet the loss still breaks him emotionally, causing him to withdraw. Eventually, Brian is discharged from the hospital. Saya drives Brian home through a city visibly rotting from gang violence and decay. They sit in silence as they arrive at the house where everything was taken from them. Brian stares at the empty front yard, remembering happier days when his son Taylor played there with him. Inside, Taylor's toys remain untouched, the Christmas tree still standing with his unopened present beneath it. Overwhelmed, Brian breaks down, and Saya holds him as he cries uncontrollably. Nearby, a news report detailing Taylor's death at the hands of gang violence catches Brian's eye. He rips it apart and numbly reaches for a bottle of vodka, silently begging Saya to help him cope. She breaks down too, powerless to ease his pain. The next morning, Saya prepares for work and realizes Brian never came to bed. She finds him alone, drinking in another room. Unable to reach him emotionally, she texts him about her keys, but Brian is lost in memory. Drawn to his son's untouched bedroom, Brian sits on Taylor's bed and collapses, remembering the comfort of having his child beside him. He then steps outside, replaying the moment everything ended. The day Taylor was learning to ride his bike when rival gang gunfire erupted, and they realized too late that their son had been shot, dying in their arms. Unable to remain frozen in grief any longer, Brian storms into his workshop, clears away the empty vodka bottles, and grabs his tools. Saya returns home later and pauses in her car, bracing herself before going inside. Brian is nowhere to be found. She texts him, only to notice moments later that he deliberately ignores the message. Instead, Brian retrieves Detective Vassal's card and drives to the police station, intent on getting answers. While waiting alone in Vassal's office, Brian notices photographs of known gang members pinned to the wall. He quietly takes pictures of them with his phone until he recognizes one face, the man who shot him. When Vassal finally returns, Brian is already gone. Back home, Brian pins the gangsters' photos across his wall, constructing his own investigation board. He circles December 24th on the calendar and marks it as the day he will kill them all. From that moment on, Brian dedicates himself entirely to preparation. He trains relentlessly, pushing his body through brutal workouts while studying knife-fighting videos. As his strength grows, the emotional distance between him and Saya widens, but Brian remains unmoved, consumed by revenge. Months later, Brian buys a used car, thrilled by the progress toward his goal. Meanwhile, Saya struggles under mounting bills, listening helplessly as Brian spends nights modifying the vehicle. She begins to emotionally unravel. Brian also enrolls in firearms training, initially struggling to hit his targets. Still, he persists, building a growing arsenal of weapons and monitoring police radio traffic as his transformation accelerates. One night, Brian finally forces himself to spend time with Saya. She clearly misses him, but the distance between them is undeniable. Soon after, she decides to move in with her mother and leaves Brian alone. With no one left to ground him, Brian channels his anger back into training, violently unloading his rage on his practice dummy. He takes his modified car out late at night, pushing it hard as he sharpens his driving skills. By October, Brian begins actively surveilling the gang's known hideouts, photographing their movements and tracking their routines. During one stakeout, he spots Pa with a woman, then notices another man leaving the scene and quickly snaps the car's license plate. At this point, Brian has completely transformed. He's physically powerful, highly conditioned, and fully in control behind the wheel. At the shooting range, he hits his targets in rapid succession with deadly accuracy. The gang doesn't stand a chance anymore. One day, Brian sees a young boy who looks just like Taylor and instinctively pulls him into a hug, only to realize it isn't his son. Later, he watches Pa casually handing out money to neighborhood kids. Brian reaches for his knife but stops himself, knowing there are too many children nearby. Moments later, he bumps into one of the gangsters, gets shoved to the ground, and the man's girlfriend humiliates him by dumping ice cream all over him, adding insult to injury. On the night of December 23rd, Brian finally puts his plan into motion. He tracks down the home of one of the gang members and quietly breaks in. When the man hears a noise and comes to investigate, Brian ambushes him and knocks him unconscious. The gangster later wakes up hogtied and suspended from the ceiling in Brian's garage. Wearing a welding mask, Brian cuts him down and forces him into a chair. He hands the man a stack of papers and a pen, demanding information on the gang's operations and leadership. Brian sits back, expecting compliance, but the gangster suddenly attacks, managing to break free. He grabs Brian's knife and stabs him in the leg. The two men struggle violently, crashing into each other as Brian fights through the pain. Using a screwdriver, Brian stabs the man and tackles him to the ground. Despite the injury, the gangster continues fighting, pushing Brian to his limits. After a brutal struggle, Brian finally overpowers him and beats him into submission, proving he's no longer the broken man he once was. On December 24th, Brian begins his final preparations. He straps on body armor, loads his weapons, and carefully checks every piece of gear. Before leaving, he writes a note and takes one last, lingering look at Taylor's room, knowing there's a chance he may never come back. Brian then visits Saya, watching quietly as she draws a picture of Taylor, her own way of coping with the loss. Without saying much, Brian leaves and heads to Taylor's grave. Since it's his son's birthday, he brings a gift and sits alone beside the headstone, finally allowing himself to cry after holding everything in for so long. He opens the present and leaves it there for Taylor before walking away. And that same night, Detective Vassal hears a noise at his door and approaches cautiously with his gun drawn. When he opens it, he's stunned to find a bound and gagged gang member left on his doorstep, along with a note. The police arrive shortly after to take the man into custody. Vassal reads Brian's note, which states that Brian will handle what the police failed to stop. Along with the message is a flash drive containing detailed evidence Brian gathered over the past year, names, locations, and proof tying the entire gang together. While driving, Brian hears a police report about gang activity and immediately heads toward the location. When he arrives, he sees two gang members violently beating and robbing a couple. As one of the attackers starts to walk away, Brian slams his car into them, pinning one man against a wall. He steps out and stabs him without hesitation. The second gangster is dragged along on Brian's hood as the car speeds off. The man pulls a gun, but Brian disarms him and shoots him dead. Overwhelmed by what he's just done, Brian pulls over and vomits, his first kill finally hitting him. Brian then drives to the gang's compound and throws a wrapped package over the wall. Inside, one of the men delivers it to the gang boss, Pa, who opens it to find severed fingers. Brian's message has been delivered. Elsewhere in the city, another massive gang shootout erupts, leaving multiple police officers wounded and pinned down. Brian charges straight into the chaos. He sees a female officer get shot and immediately drives into the firefight, gunning down gang members as bullets tear into his car. One gangster livestreams the attack directly to Pa, as the crew unloads on Brian's vehicle. Brian pushes forward anyway and tries to save the wounded officer, but she's shot again and dies beside him. He pushes her body out of the car, spots the man livestreaming the carnage, and rams him with the vehicle before stepping out and shooting him, making sure Pa sees it happen live. Pa quickly pieces together that Brian is behind the attack and sends out a message ordering every gangster in the city to hunt him down. Nearby, a group of thugs beating a rival Brian's car approaching. He locks eyes with them, gives a cold stare, and drives off without engaging. Brian pulls onto a bridge and takes out an old music toy that once belonged to Taylor. He listens to it for a moment, grounding himself and reminding himself exactly why he's doing this. Then he puts it away and drives on. The gangsters soon catch up and a high-speed chase erupts through the city streets. Brian suddenly slams the brakes, spins the car around, and comes face to face with his pursuers. He drifts sideways, firing into their vehicle and killing one of the men before speeding off again. The chase intensifies as a biker joins in, opening fire on Brian's already damaged car. Brian pushes harder but runs straight into a roadblock, getting pinned between two trucks filled with gunmen. He kills one attacker, then executes a perfect PIT maneuver on the front truck, sending both vehicles crashing into each other in a violent wreck. The biker is still on him, firing at close range. The rider pulls alongside and aims through the window, but Brian grabs the gun, yanking it away and causing the biker to lose control. Brian then slams the bike into a wall, ending the pursuit. With the street finally silent, Brian pulls over and takes a moment to catch his breath. Bloodied, shaken, but still standing. Detective Vassal sits in his car studying the evidence Brian left behind. After hearing reports of the attacks on the gang, he decides to move and head straight for the gang's headquarters. Inside the building, Pa realizes things are spiraling out of control and sends out an urgent message ordering all his men to return to him immediately. Nearby, Brian pulls over just outside the gang's building. He listens to Taylor's music toy once more, letting memories of better days wash over him. Then he checks his weapons, notices the message Pa sent out on a phone he stole earlier, and recognizes the opportunity. Brian mounts a motorcycle and heads in to finish what the gang started. He slips into the hideout right behind a convoy of returning gangsters. As soon as he enters, a gunfight explodes. Brian detonates his motorcycle, triggering a massive blast that engulfs several men in flames. Chaos erupts as the gang members are cut down one by one. Unaware of the carnage below, Pa continues enjoying himself upstairs. Brian begins working his way up the building, pausing only briefly to catch his breath as shouts and gunfire echo through the halls. Armed gangsters rush down the staircase and Brian cuts them down as they appear, switching seamlessly between gunfire and hand-to-hand combat. His training is on full display, none of them can stop him. He switches to his sidearm and continues pushing forward. While reloading his shotgun, Brian is hit 3 times in his body armor and knocked to the floor, but he quickly recovers. He plants an explosive trap in the main hallway and moves on. Suddenly, he's attacked by a heavily built gangster named Ruiz. Ruiz easily overpowers him, throwing Brian around and disarming him when he reaches for his weapon. Brian absorbs several brutal punches as Ruiz dominates the fight. When other gangsters accidentally trigger the explosive trap, the distraction gives Brian an opening. He stabs Ruiz in the shoulder, but Ruiz refuses to go down and responds by slamming Brian with a crushing suplex. At the same time, Detective Vassal enters the building, stepping over bodies and destruction as he follows the trail upward. Brian and Ruiz are both exhausted, struggling to catch their breath. They reach for their guns at the same time. Ruiz fires first, but Brian reacts faster, knocking the weapon aside and shooting Ruiz point blank, killing him instantly. Nearby, Detective Vassal is ambushed but manages to fight back, taking down the attackers with precision. He eventually finds Brian, and the two briefly aim their guns at each other in silence. After a tense pause, Vassal lowers his weapon, signaling that he's not there to stop Brian. Their moment is cut short when Pa's lieutenant opens fire on them. Brian and Vassal dive for cover as she reloads and shoots again, hitting Brian and then wounding Vassal in the arm. Using the confusion, Brian crawls toward her and presses his gun to her head, forcing her to drop her weapon. He hesitates, unable to pull the trigger. She takes advantage of that hesitation, drawing a hidden pistol and shooting Brian twice before turning the gun on Vassal. Seeing this, Brian reacts instantly and kills her. Both men struggle to recover from their injuries. Brian retrieves his gun and continues deeper into the building to find Pa. When they finally confront each other, they exchange gunfire. Brian absorbs several hits to his body armor and collapses. Pa moves in to finish him off, but Vassal shoots Pa in the back at the last second. Brian tackles Pa to the ground, beating him mercilessly before wrapping his hands around his throat and strangling him as Pa fights to survive. As the life drains from Pa's eyes, Brian stares back, imagining Taylor smiling at him one last time. Detective Vassal painfully crawls toward Brian, who lies motionless on the floor. As Brian fades in and out of consciousness, memories of Taylor flood his mind. He sees fragments of his son's short life, moments of laughter and innocence, followed by visions of the future Taylor never got to live, growing older, smiling, and becoming the man he was meant to be. The scene shifts to Saya, standing alone at Taylor's grave. A small toy train circles the headstone, a quiet symbol of Brian's final act of love. Saya kneels down and reads a handwritten note Brian left behind, her face heavy with grief and understanding. After a moment, she gently places the note at the grave and walks away, leaving the train to continue its endless loop around her son's resting place. And that is how it ended. Make sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this, and you can find this movie in the description below or our comment section. Thanks for watching.